On a winter morning, Rome learned how quickly certainty could vanish. The familiar choreography of empire, the processions, the decrees, the polite fictions of consensus gave way to hurried footsteps and guarded conversations. Names rose and fell in the space of hours. Messages traveled faster than law. In the city that called itself eternal, the imperial throne revealed a frightening truth. It could be claimed quickly, and it could be lost even faster. Those who held it that year would not be remembered for grand conquests or lasting monuments. Their reigns were too brief, their victories too contingent, their promises too costly. Yet their presence mattered, because in a single year Rome absorbed a lesson it could never unlearn. Emperors were not selected by destiny, nor secured by antique precedent, nor guaranteed by the Senate's formal vote. In practice, they were confirmed by armed loyalty, by which formations moved first, which officers committed, and which treasuries could meet expectations on time. By any measure, the state had begun to look like a prize, even by the standards of their own time. It was a shock, because it exposed how thin the veneer of civil order could be. Once military leverage entered the open, the rupture did not begin with a foreign invasion. It began with a vacant palace and a succession problem that had never been solved. From that vacuum, a struggle for authority spread with a speed that suggested the system had been waiting to break. Rome, in the late 1st century, rested on wealth and disciplined force. Framed by ritual, the Senate still met, still debated, still wrapped its authority in antique language. But real power had long since concentrated in one office, the princeps, first citizen in theory, monarch in practice. The empire's legitimacy rested on a practical bargain. The ruler kept the legions supplied and paid, ensured grain shipments arrived, maintained roads and infrastructure, and performed the public obligations of religion. In return, Rome accepted what it preferred not to name. That liberty had become managerial, administered from above, and preserved mainly as performance. Romans praised disciplina and gravitas, the stiff virtues of an older political imagination. Yet the capital also lived on spectacle and distribution, games that transformed conflict into entertainment, festivals that turned politics into theater, and above all the grain dole that kept the city fed. Beneath these rituals lay the imperial system's unresolved tension, succession. Augustus had fashioned monarchy while denying the title. He had built a state that could be governed by one man, but he had not created an agreed rulebook for what happened when that man was gone. Each transition tested obedience, because no statute could compel a general with loyal troops to accept another general's claim. For most people, Rome's grandeur appeared in smaller measures that could not be argued away. It was felt in the price of bread, the reliability of the coinage, the availability of work, and the rumor of soldiers moving on the roads. An unskilled laborer in Rome might earn only a few sesterces for a day's toil, sometimes less when buildings slowed or patronage dried up. In stable years, evidence from Italian towns such as Pompeii suggested that an ordinary loaf could cost a couple of assize small change, but not trivial when income could vanish with illness, injury, or the sudden absence of employment. Milk was not an urban staple as it would be in later centuries, where it appeared often goat or sheep milk. Its price fluctuated by season and region, so widely that ancient writers treated it as rural certainty and urban rarity. In the city, survival depended less on milk than on grain, cheap wine, olives, and on whether the state's supply system held long enough for tomorrow to resemble today. When Nero's reign ended and the Julio-Claudian line extinguished, that supply system trembled because the empire had to answer the most dangerous question in politics. Who commanded when the old command ended? The answer would not come from philosophy. It would come from three men carried forward by ambition, resentment, fear, and the marching discipline of armies. Servius Sulpicius Galba came first, born into the old Roman aristocracy, a man whose ancestors' wax masks looked down from family halls like stern judges. He had governed provinces, commanded armies, served emperors, and survived their suspicions. In youth, he was reputed disciplined, even severe. In age, that severity hardened into something colder. When the empire was young, Rome admired such a man. When the empire became a marketplace of favors, a man who refused to bargain threatened everyone who lived by the bargain. Marcus Otho was shaped by a different Rome, one of courtly intrigue and private appetite. Born into a family of respectable standing, he learned early that access mattered more than ancestry. and that the emperor's friendship could become the shortest road to exile. He had been close to Nero and then pushed away. The intimacy turned into a warning. Sent to govern Lusitania, far from the capital's temptations and dangers, he learned patience and the art of waiting behind a mask, the skill of appearing loyal while counting the days until opportunity returned. Aulus Vitellius also came from noble birth, yet reputation clung to him like spilled wine. He had moved through imperial courts, pleasing those who held power, surviving through charm and indulgence. Ancient sources, often hostile and shaped by later politics, portrayed him as pliable, carried along by stronger wills. Whatever he belonged to the ruling class and had been raised within the assumption that high birth entitled one to high office and that Rome's highest office could be reached by those who kept the favor of those who commanded men under arms. Compared to these men, the average Roman lived at a different altitude entirely, an artisan shaping leather sandals, a dock worker hauling grain sacks from ships, a washerwoman scrubbing clothes in cold water. Such people lived close to hunger and closer to debt. They bought bread, cheap wine, a little oil, perhaps fish, when the market allowed. They slept in cramped apartments, stacked in insulae, vulnerable to fire and collapse. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius moved among estates, clients, and servants, in a world where a single dinner could cost more than a laborer's monthly earnings. Their status belonged to a category of power ordinary life could not easily imagine, access not merely to wealth, but to the state itself. As Nero's reign ended in revolt and despair, these three men moved toward the center of the storm, each carried by the same truth. Rome's throne had become an empty prize, and the first to grasp it would be the one whose soldiers believed they could profit by the grasp. When Nero fled and took his own life in June of 68, the empire's nerves snapped. The end was not simply the loss of a ruler, it was the collapse of a dynastic identity that had defined the regime since Augustus. Governors and generals measured distance from Rome in days of marching, and loyalty in the weight of gold. In Hispania, Galba was proclaimed emperor by his troops. The Senate, desperate to replace a disgraced ruler with a figure of old Roman gravity, recognized him. Galba did not approach power like a young conqueror. He entered it like a magistrate arriving to restore order, stern, lawful, and unprepared for what the imperial system had become under decades of court politics and military bargaining. His ascent seemed at first like a return to sanity, yet the throne he inherited was poisoned by expectation. Nero's rule had trained the empire to anticipate gifts. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, and the emperor's personal shield expected donatives, cash distributions, when a new ruler took power. Galba, austere and proud, refused to purchase what he believed should be owed. He also relied heavily on advisors whose greed and arrogance alienated the city. In a system where the ruler's safety depended on men who could calculate their reward, virtue without generosity became less a moral stance than a strategic risk. Galba's severity touched nerve after nerve. Those who had enriched themselves under Nero feared confiscation. Those who had hoped for advancement met delays and refusals. Soldiers saw discipline without compensation. The Senate praised him, but praise was cheap. The streets listened for the sound that mattered more than rhetoric. Whether the guard remained reliable, Otho watched with a gambler's patience. He had supported Galba, expecting reward, perhaps adoption as heir, perhaps a clear path to succession. In Rome, adoption was politics sanctified by family language. It could turn strangers into sons, and sons into emperors. Galba, seeking a young successor of noble character and, he believed, public approval, chose another man, Lucius Calpurnius Piso. The decision was meant to stabilize the regime, to make succession look lawful rather than accidental. Instead, it humiliated Otho and signaled to the Praetorian Guard that their interests might again be treated as secondary. In that moment, the empire's private arithmetic became public. Otho turned to the one institution that could unmake emperors as easily as it made them. Promises were made in sums that would have stunned ordinary Romans. Ancient sources described extraordinarily large donatives offered per soldier amounts that could equal years of a laborer's earnings for a single man in uniform. It was loyalty purchased in a single transaction, and it exposed the new logic of power, not justice, not lineage, not even senatorial consensus, but payment delivered on time. In January of 69, Galba walked into a coordinated betrayal. The Guard, once the emperor's protective barrier, became the mechanism of removal. In the Forum, amid statues of gods and heroes, Galba and Piso were eliminated in public view, and their remains were used as a grim form of proof, displayed so the city could not pretend the office still protected the man. It was not simply a transfer of authority, it was a message. The imperial title had become negotiable, and negotiation was conducted in the language of force and reward. Otho was hailed emperor, and for a brief, breathless moment it seemed the capital had chosen its new master. That was the moment. Rome's crisis sharpened into something worse than a palace coup. Beyond Italy, legions had already made their own choice. Along the Rhine, hardened armies watched the center with resentment. They guarded cold frontiers, endured long service, and saw emperors made and unmade by courtiers and the guard. Their anger was not abstract. It was the anger of men who believed their labor preserved the empire, while Rome treated them as instruments. They proclaimed Vitellius emperor, not because he was a great commander, but because he was their candidate familiar, acceptable, and a symbol of their demand to be heard and compensated. Two emperors now existed within one empire, and the collision would be decided not by Senate speeches, but by logistics, discipline, and battlefield outcomes. An emperor's wealth, in such a moment, was less the slow accumulation of private fortune than the sudden control of imperial machinery. He could command the mint, taxation, the grain supply, the sale of offices, and the confiscations that followed accusations of treason. It was not merely a salary, but possession of the state's economic apparatus. In Rome, such control could be won in days if the army agreed. Whether it was called bribery or generosity depended largely on who survived to define the terms. Otho's reign began with a frantic attempt to look legitimate. He sought the Senate's approval, offered conciliation, and presented himself as a stabilizer after Galba's removal. He tried to soothe the city's nerves, because legitimacy in Rome had a practical face, order, and grain. He kept the machinery running, at least for the moment, and he avoided immediate reprisals that might have turned the capital into a cycle of retaliations. Yet even as the Senate confirmed him, the Rhine legions were already moving. The defining achievement of that year was not a reform etched in stone, but a revelation carved into the empire's memory. The emperor could be made elsewhere, and Rome could do little but react. The Republic's old myth had been that power flowed from the city outward. The struggle of 69 proved that power could flow inward from the provinces, carried by military infrastructure, and that the capital's applause often followed the sound of approaching formations. Otho confronted a problem that imperial systems repeatedly faced: how to prevent a state from fracturing when rival armed forces claimed authority. Negotiation risked appearing weak. Delay risked allowing Vitellius to gather greater strength. A decisive engagement promised an answer but threatened Italy itself. The logic of the system forced Otho's hand. If his claim rested on soldiers, then soldiers would demand he act as a commander rather than a mediator. He marched north, and Italy became a theatre of operations. Near Bedriacum, close to Cremona. In April of 69, Roman fought Roman under banners that each claimed to defend the same empire. The fighting was harsh and confused, the kind of engagement where exhaustion and miscommunication mattered as much as courage, and where advantage often belonged to the side that arrived late with fresher troops. Otho's forces broke. The situation presented him with a choice: prolong the conflict and gamble that reinforcements might reverse the result, or end the struggle at the cost of his own life. Ancient writers, who did not always grant mercy in their judgments, regarded his decision with grim respect. Otho took his own life rather than continue, an act meant to spare Rome further losses and also to shape how his brief reign would be remembered. In a world where reputation survived the body, self-destruction could function as both sacrifice and statement. Yet a dignified end could not mend the empire's torn fabric. It only cleared the way for the next claimant. Vitellius entered Rome as victor, and the city watched a new emperor arrive backed by frontier legions. His accession revealed another trap built into the system. Victory created obligations. Soldiers expected payment, rewards, and recognition. The treasury, strained by previous distributions and the cost of mobilization, groaned under the demands of yet another army that believed it had purchased the empire through service. The Praetorian Guard had learned it could set a price on loyalty. The Rhine legions now insisted they could collect the price of victory. Vitellius tried to satisfy those expectations under the pressure of time. A ruler elevated by soldiers could not quickly refuse soldiers' claims without inviting the same fate Galba had suffered. Money had to be found, and finding it meant draining reserves, accelerating collections, and squeezing the machinery of state. He attempted to keep the city quiet, and the legions content. Ancient accounts, shaped by hostility from later Flavian authors and the moral tastes of elite historians, emphasized his feasting and excess. The truth was likely tangled with propaganda. Still, the broader reality remained difficult to deny. Internal conflict consumed resources at a pace that no administrative virtue could easily reverse, and the appetite of victorious troops was not satisfied by ceremony. Rome might have preserved the illusion that emperors were chosen by orderly adoption and senatorial consent had the transition after Nero been clean. Instead, the illusion broke in stages, each stage more visible than the last. Galba's refusal to purchase loyalty exposed the Guard's leverage. Otho's coup proved the city's elite soldiers could effectively auction the regime. Vitellius's elevation proved frontier legions could impose their will on the capital. With each turn, the state moved closer to a military monarchy in which the decisive voice belonged to the strongest armies and the leaders who could promise them the most. Even as Vitellius settled into the palace, new standards rose in the east, and a more formidable contender gathered strength beyond the horizon. Opposition in 69 did not cohere into a single ideology. It was the empire's geography turned into factions. The Rhine legions had their emperor. The Praetorian Guard had already demonstrated its power as kingmaker. The Senate, caught between fear and flattery, tried to survive whichever name prevailed, wrapping each new reign in ceremonies it no longer controlled. In the east, where Rome's provinces faced Parthia and managed vast revenues, another commander watched events with calculation: Vespasian, a seasoned general overseeing the war in Judea, while Galba, Otho, and Vitellius fought for Italy. Eastern armies and their allies weighed the cost of allowing the empire to be decided by the Rhine and the Guard alone. In such a world, legitimacy could be argued in public and decided in barracks. The slogans differed, the forms were ancient, but the contest reduced to a recognizable struggle among armed institutions, each claiming to represent Rome while pursuing its own survival. For common people, the consequences were immediate: requisitions, disrupted trade, and fear that settled into daily life like dust. Armies on the move did not purchase gently. They took as a matter of policy and necessity. Farmers along marching routes lost grain and livestock. Towns were forced to billet soldiers, feeding men who might repay them with theft, intimidation, or sporadic violence. In Rome, rumor itself became an instrument. Each change of emperor threatened denunciations, retaliations, and sudden shifts in the value of yesterday's loyalty. A baker could endure the price of flour rising. He could not endure a soldier's whim if the street turned into a front line. Vitellius faced compromises that mirrored those of his rivals, because the system pressed every claimant toward the same tools. To reward supporters, offices could be distributed for loyalty rather than competence. Enemies' property could be seized under legal pretexts. Accusations could become revenue. The Senate performed unanimity, praising rulers it privately feared, because fear was safer than principled resistance. In such an atmosphere, corruption became less a personal vice than a symptom of a state in panic, where each faction paid its debts immediately or risked collapse. By mid-year, the struggle widened. Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by Eastern legions and key allies. His supporters moved swiftly, understanding that speed was survival. One of his generals, Antonius Primus, drove into Italy. The second battle near Bedriacum ended in disaster for Vitellius's cause. Cremona was sacked, and Italy's wounds deepened. The empire consumed itself, not on distant frontiers but in the heartland that supplied Rome's bread and manpower, and the human cost followed every mile the armies advanced. In the capital, Vitellius wavered between resistance and negotiation. He attempted to abdicate, then attempted to reclaim power, pulled back by desperate supporters whose fates were tied to his. The streets filled with armed men. Temples and public buildings became fortified positions. The center of the world, in Roman imagination, was reduced to urban fighting. The city's stones turned into cover, and the sacred turned into strategic ground. The story that had begun with the public degradation of Galba's remains moved toward its last, inevitable act. In December of 69, Vespasian's supporters entered Rome. Fighting flared near the capital itself. the sacred hill associated with Rome's highest gods and civic identity. Fire and weapons turned holy space into contested ground. The damage there shocked contemporaries, as if political conflict had struck at the symbols that held the city together. Vitellius was found hiding. Ancient accounts differed on details, some emphasizing humiliation, others suggesting confusion and fear, and it remained difficult to separate observation from the moral judgments later writers attached to a defeated ruler. What remained consistent was the outcome. He was dragged through the streets, beaten, mocked, and put to death. His body was thrown into the Tiber, denied burial rites. The city that had once dressed emperors in triumphal purple stripped one and discarded him, as if to demonstrate that the office could be erased as easily as it had been bestowed. The impact of Galba, Otho and Vitellius was not measured in laws passed or provinces annexed, but in the speed with which they accelerated a transformation already underway. Their rises demonstrated how quickly imperial power could be captured by the right coalition of soldiers. Their downfalls demonstrated how little protection the title offered when those coalitions shifted. Each reign, brief as a winter day, illuminated a different weakness in Rome's political anatomy, and through those weaknesses a harder, more militarized empire emerged, one that Vespasian would claim and attempt to stabilize. After the upheaval, Rome was exhausted, and exhaustion could resemble peace. The city had not been taken by a foreign enemy. It had been overtaken by the consequences of its own design, a system that demanded one man at the top and offered no universally accepted means of choosing him. The legacy of the Year of the Four Emperors was argued in tones that mirrored the event itself. Some historians emphasized chaos and moral decay. Others underlined the resilience of Roman institutions that survived internal conflict without total collapse. Ancient sources, especially those writing under the Flavian dynasty that followed, often painted Galba as miserly, Otho as theatrical, Vitellius as debauched portraits sharpened by political need and by the habit of explaining catastrophe through character. Modern assessment could not escape the same problem. Personalities mattered, but the structure they inhabited mattered more. Beneath the judgments lay a truth the year made unmistakable. The emperor was not merely first citizen, he was commander-in-chief, and his claim depended on the compliance of organized force. In the long term, the year reshaped Rome's understanding of legitimacy. It confirmed that provincial armies were not peripheral but central, capable of determining succession. It demonstrated the leverage of the Praetorian Guard, whose proximity to the palace became a permanent variable in every reign. It also cleared the path for the Flavian dynasty, beginning with Vespasian, which rebuilt finances, restored a measure of stability, and anchored imperial authority in military success and administrative competence rather than Julio-Claudian blood. That stabilization did not erase the lesson of 69. It normalized it. The empire could function after internal war, but it would function with the knowledge that force stood behind every ceremony. The year endured because it revealed how quickly a sophisticated state could be reduced to competing claims of authority. When clear rules of succession failed, tradition alone could not restrain ambition. Public order depended on institutions strong enough to outlast individuals, and on a political culture that did not treat government as spoil. Rome survived 69, but it did not emerge unchanged. After it, the center of gravity shifted toward the legions, and every future emperor ruled under the shadow of that precedent, whether he admitted it or not. From Galba's rigid virtue to Otho's calculated gamble to Vitellius's costly indulgence, the story was not merely about three failed rulers. It was about an empire discovering the price of power when power had